All right, we're live. Hello, everybody. I'm Nathan Keel Springer, the lead organizer of Psychedelically Speaking, and thank you all for joining us at this inaugural event co-hosted by U Ottawa's Psychedelics and Spirituality Studies Initiative and the Society for the Advancement of Psychonautic Studies. I'll explain more about that in a moment. I think I can speak for all of us when I say we're extremely grateful and excited that Erika has offered her time to us today. We really appreciate it. We're kicking this whole series off with a bang. But before I give the floor to Erika, I just want to mention a few things, kind of give some context. I wanted to thank Anne Vallely for initiating the speaker series, bringing up the idea in the first place, and really her push to bring all of the psychedelic study stuff to U Ottawa has made a huge impact. And I think this series is kind of a ripple of that. So I also want to give many, many thanks to Reed and Arsha, Ashley Robinson, and Heather Hannah, who are, I think most of them are here right now. They have all put in a ton of work into making this happen and to setting the template for future events. And, there's a lot of work that goes into that, and this would not be happening without their time and dedication. It's a labor of love, so I just wanted to express my appreciation there. So about SAPS, which again is the Society for Advancement of Psychonautic Studies. So this is a research and education initiative founded by Reed Barber. What began over 2 years ago as a simple Discord server offering an online library of research papers and a discussion space has grown into a collective that brings people together with a shared interest in psychedelics and other psychonautic ventures. SAPS is now positioning itself as an incubator and launchpad for initiatives focused on psychonautics. We believe we're on the cusp of a major shift in this field and are dedicated to supporting the potential of a new generation of psychonautic researchers. In a research field as tenuous as ours, we deeply believe in the necessity of community building and mutual aid. So we're thrilled to announce Psychedelically Speaking as SAP's first major initiative. We hope it will set the tone for the exciting journey ahead. It's a monthly speaker series that aims to foster multifaceted, interdisciplinary conversations on psychedelics and consciousness. Our goal is to hit these topics from as many angles as possible, as I was saying just a moment ago, in order to gain collective illumination and raise further questions for inquiry. We're also organizing a graduate student conference for the spring. There should be information out on that within the week. So stay tuned for that and for other upcoming speaker events. If you have a research or educational initiative you'd like to propose, or if you're interested in partnering with us, please don't hesitate to reach out to sapsottawa@gmail.com. I will put that in the chat right at this moment. That will also allow you to sign up for our email list and be informed of future events. But with that out of the way, I'd like to segue into introducing our speaker, who really doesn't need an introduction for most of you. Erika Dyck is a professor and the Canada Research Chair in the History of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. She's written extensively about the history of medicine, the history of madness and psychiatry, and of course, psychedelics, among other things. Her books, Psychedelic Psychiatry and the Acid Room, deal in particular with both the clinical and cultural aspects of LSD in North America in the 50s and 60s. She's also written about the evolving state of the psychedelic humanities, a topic especially relevant to the initiative here at U Ottawa and of great importance to psychedelic studies in general. Needless to say, Erika has established herself as a leader in the study of psychedelics, and we're very honored to have her here with us today. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to you, Erika.
Thanks so much, Nathan. That's very generous of you. I'm going to try to share my screen here. It's working. Good. Awesome. I'm so honored to be part of this inaugural series that you're starting. And I'm not sure I will live up to your standards, either of the high praise or the promise to, blow your mind in any particular way. But I do hope to challenge some of the thinking in maybe small ways. and maybe set the stage a little bit with this historical overview of some of the things that I think have, been driving me over the last few years, thinking about Canada's place in the psychedelic resurgence, what role we might see here, but also trying to think about the resurgence as something bigger than psychedelics, or where psychedelics might find a role in opening up our minds to different ways of thinking about, what's at stake in a psychedelic resurgence. So I'm here joining you via Zoom from Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis, the Saskatchewan Métis, I should say. And that's more than a salutary gesture. It's something that I'm going to return to throughout this presentation as we think about some of the ways in which psychedelics may open up possibilities for reconciliation with Indigenous ways of thinking about, well, traditional or spiritual healing, but also around ideas of preservation and conservation. And it's something that's become really important to me over the last few years, which I'll talk about in a moment. And when Arsha asked me to come in and speak to you, I had spoken to McMaster a little while ago, but at that time I was still in the process of completing a project on an illustrated history of psychedelics. So I'm going to share some of the images from, so they're not, I don't have all the citations here, but I'm going to give a blanket citation shout out right now to Psychedelics, A Visual Odyssey, which is a book that I published in April. And some of the images are going to be from there, including this one, which hopefully helps us to sort of anchor this talk a little bit. This is from Elmer Smith, who was the artist working with Richard Schultes, the so-called father of ethnobotany, whose studies in the Amazonian region sort of brought forth a bunch of different ideas about psychoactive substances in Latin America and in the Amazon in particular. And if anyone has seen that golden guide to hallucinogens, these are some of the images that are put together in a bit of a collage. And I wanted to start with this, just thinking about the relationship between plants and consciousness, plants and teachers, and place as we move through this conversation. So I'll get on with it. So now I'm going to go back on my word. Not in Psychedelics, A Visual Odyssey, but in a different project. I started with this kind of probably ridiculous tweet, some of those things we did during COVID. And I was like, can somebody write a history of psychedelics without Timothy Leary in it? And over the course of the next several years, we started collecting article ideas, chapter ideas, many actually in languages other than English. And then after working with translators and some new authors, some recognized authors, we put together this, I think it's 22 chapters in Expanding Mindscapes, and tried to get a broader picture of some of the ways that, I'll say the word psychedelics, but non-ordinary experiences, non-ordinary states of consciousness, started to, take hold or take root in different parts of the world at different times. And as we got working on that project, we tried to map some of the flow of ideas. And in doing so, we went to online resources. This was mostly done during COVID. Online resources that helped to point to published papers. We didn't go to archives, but we went to kind of what's available on the internet, but in a peer-reviewed fashion to help us to map out this spread of ideas. And Jeffrey Wallace created these maps for us. He's a historical cartographer. And here are a few for peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, and ayahuasca. And the maps were really interesting, and they got our conversation going as we sort of thought through this. And then stories or chapters and articles started coming in, and it didn't match what we were seeing on the maps necessarily. Some of it we anticipated. There's, San Francisco plays a role, but some things were also not featured in these maps. And so we thought, well, what accounts for this disjuncture that we see between what is available in the published record and the kinds of stories, and again, I'll say stories because I really want to blend different ways of thinking about this, but the kinds of studies and histories that are emerging from different parts of the world about this history. So that sent us down another rabbit hole, so to speak, not to get too much carried away with Lewis Carroll and his own drug-induced experiences. Well, we started sort of following the stories, the studies of people working in places like India, Alex Guerin, for example, he was working in Hong Kong, but studying how ayahuasca made its way into Australia and parts of Asia. And these were stories that we weren't finding in the sort of regular literature and the psychedelic literature at the time. So we really wanted to sort of create a platform for talking about that. And in combination with collecting those chapters, I also started on my own adventure looking for images that also helped to tell a different story or shifted the way I was thinking about the history of psychedelics, things that moved beyond the text, but were nonetheless very important as they showcased different elements of both cultural, but also spiritual, ceremonial, and medical or clinical aspects of the history of psychedelics. And I'll just continue to use that word somewhat anachronistically, but the history of these kinds of things that we now collapse under that concept of psychedelics. And so here are a few examples of just, where that research took us in terms of thinking about, there's a rather iconic image at the top and the middle. Many of you will have seen this Pulitzer Prize winning image of the, man putting a Gerber daisy into the barrel of a gun during an anti-Vietnam War protest. I later learned from oral histories that he was also a fairly prominent acid dealer, probably in the area. Sorry, he was probably an acid dealer. He definitely was in the area. And images like the Beatles are, of course, part and parcel with this kind of history, even in a superficial sense of it. But some of the other images may be less familiar and less well known. And those are the parts where I wanted to sort of dig in and try to gain a deeper appreciation for how psychedelics grabbed the imagination of people in different ways, whether that was through Tropicalia. You might see an album cover there. This is kind of Brazil's response to psychedelic counterculture through music, which does not sound like Bob Dylan. It has like soap opera themes, it has big band themes, it has a very different kind of sound and feel, but it is a quintessential part of a counterculture that existed during a military dictatorship, where the consequences of being counter to anything were very different than what we might imagine was possible in the United States or Canada at the time. So, the psychedelics are still very much animating part of a response or a kind of rejection of certain state values, but had to be done in a different way. And the music also really brings in these Afro-Brazilian elements and traditions. And so anyway, that's just to sort of paint the picture. I won't talk about all of these pictures, but each of them kind of helps to represent different ways that we might come at this history. And I was really fortunate to work with a couple of archaeologists and ethnobotanists who've not only helped me to source some of this material, but also through those conversations have helped me to appreciate that there's a deep and rich and fertile history here that for many reasons has not been told because it also blends or kind of clashes with different colonial ideas. And to take an example, the tapestry that you see at the top there is an image from pre-contact. It's a Mixtec ceremony. I'm told this is not research that I do myself. So this is all ventriloquized through the good work of Osiris Romero Gonzalez, who's helped me to appreciate this. He's a postdoc right now at Harvard University, but prior to that, he was a postdoc here in Saskatchewan. And he's been working with archaeologists and linguists to try to understand some of the psilocybin mushroom ceremonies that took place prior to contact. And that's interesting in and of itself. But to think that, the heavy sort of influence of Christianity and missionaries really changed the way those stories could be told and the way they could be remembered. So there were real consequences to maintaining and preserving this history. And these are, these small bits and pieces that still remain are really important for a bit of a touchstone back to some of that earlier work. We see the same kind of things in this epitaph in the top right. This is an Egyptian epitaph that, according to Paul Stamets, he also believes that Egyptians were using what we probably think now are psilocybin mushrooms in different ceremonies, but were done in a very different way that was used only by the pharaoh and was really a very special and honored position to be able to take those mushrooms to have insights into a variety of decisions, whether it was decisions about military strategy or decisions about moving communities. But these, you can see the kind of embedded influence of what we might later call plant teachers in different contexts, in different parts of the world, and certainly with these early contexts. And again, I won't talk about each of these, but recently I've been doing some work with the Native American Church. I'll talk a bit more about that in a few moments, but thinking about the way that the peyote cactus, which grows in a very particular region of the world around the Rio Grande, northern Mexico, southern Texas primarily, but the influence of the Native American Church and the ceremonies that even predate the Native American Church, the way that those ceremonies have spread throughout Turtle Island or North America, captured in the textual literature. So they don't make their way onto those maps that I showed you until the 20th century, when anthropologists and ethnobotanists begin recording that and publishing it in English primarily and in Spanish. But the tapestries, the oral histories, the artwork, and the songs are places where we see remnants of those earlier ceremonies that stretch back now hundreds and probably thousands of years. Now, we don't usually use that evidence when we put it on PubMed and there's no peer review process. So the way that we're collecting this information sometimes distorts our understanding of, how to privilege that evidence. Anyway, yeah, that. And I have a couple more examples of this. So these are examples of iboga ceremonies from Gabon in West Africa. One of the things that was really interesting about trying to find images, now we could find texts about iboga, although interestingly, it turned out that, French industrialists were particularly interested in finding things that would, help industrialize. So things like rubber plants were really exciting, but they would like cut down or move past this shrub that they found to be not that helpful or not that useful. And it was many years later when they recognized that people continued to use these plants, that they had another look at it. So there are a number of decades, probably almost 100 years, according to some of the articles, where iboga was kind of known by Europeans and ignored because it didn't seem to fit into, it was, some kind of strange ceremony that took place rather than it being something that fit into the industrializing mindset. Trying to find images of iboga ceremonies, though, introduced a number of new ethical challenges. These two were shared from the Guardian newspaper, which published them openly and with permission. But iboga ceremonies continue to be conducted in sacred spaces, and it's ethically, it's unethical to share insight into those ceremonies. So it's another reason why some of this is, I'm about to be cat bombed right on cue. So two of the contributors to our book to me, Villegiate and Julien Bonhomme, have both been doing work with the iboga ceremonies. And again, these are shared with permission. These two are from Julien Bonhomme. He's both the author of the article From Bwiti to Began and Back, and he's also the photographer for these images. And it's from some of this anthropological and historical work that now we are gaining a greater sort of what will show up on those maps if we come back to that as a concept, that we're gaining a greater insight into what's going on in those ceremonies and why they have not been shared, talked about, published about, studied for so long. And there's good reason for that. And it's something that I want to sort of plant this seed or, drift this spore off to you to think about, what we're doing here as, enthusiasts about psychedelics, but also some of the more humbling moments where we think about, whether we should actually pull back or think differently about how we engage in these studies, not just the ethical things that our REB committees or IRB committees are encouraging us to do, but also to think about how this affects the impact on those communities that have been keeping some of these ceremonies hidden or away from sort of published prying eyes for centuries. And one of the ways that I found really helpful to start to begin to grapple with this idea of a global history of psychedelics is it actually comes from Gordon Wasson or Robert Gordon Wasson. he and his wife, Valentina Wasson, are probably best known for sort of introducing the concept of the magic mushroom after meeting with Maria Sabina in Mexico. But the reason I have this image here is that in 1961, shortly after Valentina Wasson passed away from cancer at a fairly early age, she was in her 50s, he had written about the way that they were beginning to conceptualize the world as, they're talking about mushrooms here, but we'll extend it maybe, or maybe you'll let me extend it to psychedelics more broadly. But this idea of microphilic societies and microphobic societies. So that is some cultures and societies that are interested in exploring what mushrooms or psychedelics have to offer, and others who produce or create these cultures of phobia and denigrate the the powers or the symptoms or whatever we might call them, pathologizing that kind of behavior, criminalizing that behavior. And so this is a 17th century triptych from Hieronymus Bosch, but it kind of paints an image of some of the different scenarios that might occur. And this is, of course, a famous image associated with ergot poisoning. I've got Albert Hoffman lurking in the background here. So, ergot is the derivative of LSD. But you get this image of these different scenarios that might occur. So you've got one of despair, one of actual chaos in the middle, that's kind of the large dominating theme, and one that's a little bit more benign. And I think this is an interesting way of imagining how different communities, societies, cultures, moments in time, but also places, different places around the world, have come into contact with and given expression to what psychedelics mean in these different places. There's Valentina Wasson and Robert Gordon Wasson, like I said, most famously known for their encounters with Maria Sabina, but also for their 2-volume unparalleled history of mushrooms, stories that they collected. And here I really do mean stories. These are folklores and traditions that Valentina collected from where she grew up in Eastern Russia, later the Soviet Union, but also through parts of Scandinavia, and mixing these ideas of folkloric traditions with mushroom foraging, cultivating, and here they're interested in a whole variety of mushrooms. But these are the kinds of stories that, again, do not make their way often into the kind of information that we're necessarily using today to make decisions about what's at stake with psychedelics. You've probably seen or at least heard of the Life magazine spread about, seeking the magic mushroom, introducing this idea of the magic mushroom, and not to be outdone, and also to give a shout out to Amy Bartlett and Monica Williams, who've written about Valentina Wasson and her own description of her mushroom experience that appeared in This Week magazine shortly after the Life magazine article appeared, but also to much less fanfare and to a much smaller circulation. So she's that, I think, in addition to her premature death or her early death shortly after this period, kind of contributed to her disappearance from this history. So I shout out to her. So my sense of this, after studying psychedelics for almost 25 years now, the history of psychedelics, I should say, for about 25 years, is that, this is a part of a broader story about our relationship with plants and chemicals. And, put in a different way, also our relationship with scientific evidence and storied evidence, or different ways that we, come to prioritize or trust information when we privilege evidence to make decisions. And we can see that on display in a variety of ways. You can think probably about, you guys are in Ottawa, so you probably saw this more than many, like vaccines, for example, really kind of shook people's confidence, and, the kind of maelstrom of information that was available and what you trust. There's science, and then there's Facebook. And not to say that this is exactly the same thing, but I think there's a growing sense of discomfort about trusting science or where we should put our trust. And we see that on display, whether it's in politics or in public health. And I think that psychedelics are re-emerging in this moment, in part as a reaction to that kind of cultural ether or cultural sense of what's right and what's just in this moment. If we think about this as a story or a history of the relationship between plants and chemicals, I'm a drug historian, so this is our bread and butter. We look at the way that these different chemicals and alkaloids and then ultimately pharmaceuticals are identified in nature. The powers are harnessed, isolated, synthesized, scaled up, redistributed. This is a story of also a kind of universalizing or a medicalizing of knowledge and of symptoms and experiences. So on the one hand, you have cocaine is isolated out of the coca plants, and then you can, transform that into some kind of pain relief that theoretically is severed from its cultural connections, and it can now be redistributed around the world. Maybe I should have chosen like opium here or something, but I mean, you can imagine pain relief now being redeployed, redistributed around the world in a way that you imagine kind of universalizes that experience. It also meets market demands in different ways, but it severs that connection with perhaps the artistry and the culture that gave rise to different practices surrounding some of these different plants. And I feel like this is a very poignant part of what is at stake in the psychedelic conversation today. Should we be sort of morally opposed to scaling up production of synthetic psychedelics that might be used to improve access to psychedelic therapies because it severs things from their sort of ceremonial or cultural connections? Or should we be, where is the kind of moral upper ground here? And I don't think there's consensus on, how we should move forward in a just way. I'm going a little bit off my script there, but I was just feeling the soapbox. So I'm going to come back to my historical comfort zone. When we think about psychedelics in the context of this relationship between the kind of severing or changing relationship between plants and chemicals, Albert Hofmann looms large, and I'm excited that I was talked into purchasing this painting behind me when I was on a research trip in San Francisco, and it's exciting to connect with this one. You probably can't see, but maybe in the closer, the one on the screen, you can see Alex Gray has painted in these various different people who he I assume believes are important to this history as maybe sort of characters who've carried this history along or who changed the course of psychedelic history. And I'll leave it to you to decide whether you can identify them or whether they ought to be there. But anyway, I'll leave that alone. That could be a fun trivia quiz later. But suffice to say, Albert Hofmann has remained sort of a central figure within this history, not only for launching LSD, for synthesizing it in 1938, having the first experience in 1943. Of course, we celebrate, or some of us may celebrate, Bicycle Day, the day that he allegedly knowingly took LSD, April 19th, 1943, and because of the fuel shortages during the war, hopped on his bicycle, or maybe because he knew that he shouldn't drive. And he was followed along by his trusty assistant, Susie Ramstein, who, as far as we know, was the first woman to take LSD, which she did on, I think it's June 15th. So if you'd like to join me in trying to start and celebrate Tram Day, maybe we can celebrate Tram Day alongside Bicycle Day with a nice buffer between those with a couple of months. This story is kind of launched into the psychedelic history world as this epoch change, this sort of paradigm changing moment when LSD comes in and it challenges the direction that psychiatry is taking at the same time. Sandoz, of course, makes LSD available in 1962. Albert Hofmann also synthesizes psilocin and psilocybin from the mushrooms, which he connected with Gordon Wasson and Roger Heim from Paris. And the capacity to harness the powers of these otherwise ceremonial plants, and these kinds of plants that had these rather extraordinary effects, was something that I think captured attention and kind of shook the psychiatry world a little bit. And one of those places that's near and dear to me is the work that was done here in Saskatchewan by people like Humphrey Osmond. He's pictured here in a couple of different ways, both in a graphic novel depiction, but also as a colored photograph version in the sort of bottom middle. I won't, anyway, he'll be pictured again here coming up. Humphrey Osmond was a British psychiatrist who came to Saskatchewan after Tommy Douglas's government won an election in 1944. Humphrey Osmond was sort of frustrated with what he felt was a stifling psychoanalytic environment that he was working in, where he was in England. When he came to Saskatchewan, he already had an interest in trying to study hallucinations and in elements of non-ordinary thinking or different ways that people organize language and speech. So he's drawn to studies about people who express symptoms of psychosis. This is like really early days. The DSM is still forming at this time as well. So if you look at schizophrenia in Canada, it's a little bit different from the way schizophrenia was looking according to patient records in the UK. But suffice to say, psychosis is kind of an umbrella that pulled people together. Osmond's interested in how people see the world differently, and what better proxy to kind of gain insight, a kind of empathy for psychotic experiences, but to try mescaline and LSD, which was newly available from Sandoz. And in doing so, he launches what becomes an internationally significant research program in Saskatchewan at a major mental hospital in a place that is also politically devoted to introducing publicly funded healthcare. This is another element that I think is really important when we think about, psychedelics and access, psychedelics and their marketability, those things that if anybody's been to a psychedelic conference, maybe you go to different ones than I do, but there's always like a trade show there on the side. And it's an interesting moment to think about, what is the kind of greater purpose, or where is what direction are we going in with respect to the relationship between psychedelics and healing and healthcare economics. Osmond's work, along with others there, I'll just name them for just for brevity's sakes, but for Abram Hoffer, Teddy Weckowitz, Duncan Blewett, and a number of other people are all involved in this research in Saskatchewan. And it attracts attention from a variety of different people. Osmond's very prolific. He writes a ton of letters, but he also publishes quite frequently. And it captures the attention of Aldous Huxley, who invites him to his home in Los Angeles, California. In 1953, Humphrey Osmond drove there from Saskatchewan. I tried to follow the same trip, but it was COVID, and then there was also this election or something, so it makes it tricky. But I followed like as much as I could to follow along and make that same journey. I did not have mescaline on me. I wore a mask and I had to go through lots more spot checks. It kind of ruined the moment, but I did get to meet with Anne Schulgen along the way and talk a lot about her experiences. So a different kind of journey for me, but anyway, I digress. Humphrey Osmond drove there in 1953. He gave Aldous Huxley his first dose of mescaline. And within a month, Aldous Huxley wrote the first draft of Doors of Perception. And for some time, Doors of Perception functioned as a guidebook for therapists or researchers and curious seekers who were trying to stimulate some interest in studying the way that, in this case now, mescaline, and soon after LSD, and then shortly after that, psilocybin, and then other things will follow. But those three components are really part of the research program in the 1950s that start to draw people in. And it's truly interdisciplinary from its origin point. And just to emphasize that and to show off my nerdiness, these are, when I found this letter in the archives, I'm pretty sure I squealed audibly. It was a very exciting moment. You can maybe read in the blue ink, this is Aldous Huxley's writing: "To make the trivial world sublime, take 0.5 gram of phenerethyme." And Humphrey Osmond, always eager. He writes in the margins of many of his notes and whatnot, and you can see his handwriting in the red: "To plumb the depths or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." And he changed it already when he wrote back to Aldous a little bit later: "My dear Aldous, to fathom hell or go angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." And you'll see different versions of those rhyming couplets. Some may be other people's interpretations, but Osmond and Huxley had this playful relationship, and they bounced these ideas back and forth with each other. And I think, beyond it being, cute and fun, if you continue to read through those letters and that correspondence, they had real serious intent in developing a concept that would not necessarily tip the scales towards one way of approaching these experiences more than another. So not too psychoanalytical, not too psychopharmaceutical, that it was sort of capacious and flexible and large enough that it could invite a whole variety of thinkers and curious ways of imagining what we might do with these experiences. And I really, also probably because I squealed in the archives, I really like that we still are using that word. And I know there have been some other contenders, but I appreciate that kind of openness of spirit, or the openness of intellectual curiosity that could then help us to think through what psychedelics might be. And it's no small feat that they were kind of working against the grain at this time. So at the same time that, Osmond is encouraging psychiatric nurses and social workers, psychologists, administrators, probably a cabinet minister, I can't verify that, but I'm pretty sure, to take psychedelics to empathize with people suffering from a form of madness that seemed untouchable by modern medications at the time. Any kind of, whether it was electroconvulsive therapy or pharmaceuticals, to go to that degree of, to orient his research program in that way was rather novel. And of course, there are other psychedelic researchers who are doing this at the same time. But that psychedelic research is moving against the grain from what becomes a paradigm shifting moment in the 1950s. The introduction of the DSM in 1952, the introduction of chlorpromazine, largactil, or thorazine, the first antipsychotic medication. It's first introduced in France in 1952, in Montreal in 1952, and later in the United States in 1954. My point is that there's a flooding into the marketplace of daily use pharmaceuticals that overwhelm many of the conversations in psychiatry at this time in terms of trying to understand how to best manage symptoms, how to identify symptoms, catalog them or classify them, and also then to manage them. And so we see this shift in professions orienting towards this other way of managing madness, with the dangling kind of hope or possibility that daily dose pharmaceuticals can have a dramatic impact on healthcare economics. You could move people out of long-stay custodial institutions, something that is happening throughout the Western world and picks up speed in the 1960s. But this is going to dramatically change things, particularly for places like the UK and Canada, who are engaging in public policy experiments that are looking to continue to create publicly funded healthcare systems or to expand them. So your budget is going to go down if you can get people out of hospitals. And this is a really exciting opportunity. And psychedelics don't really fit this model. And so the idea that you would, have staff taking psychedelics to then understand and maybe therapize in a different way is already moving against the grain. And even as we get to treatments, it becomes really challenging. Despite that, a number of psychedelic research units really gather a lot of momentum. These are a couple of examples. This is from a CBS documentary that you can still see online if you're interested. These are patients who are being treated in Spring Grove. And on the right-hand side of the screen are some this is part of a long guidebook that Humphrey Osmond was working on. It's published is the wrong word, but printed in 1952. I've only ever seen one copy. I don't know how widely it's been circulated, but in it, they're trying to make sense of, perceptual changes, but also things like, how should we set up a room to optimize these kinds of experiences? And again, this is moving in a very different direction from what is looming on the other direction with pharmaceuticals, is going towards a randomized controlled trial, distancing the observer from the patient. And with psychedelics, you see that relationship coming even closer together, that the kind of blurring of the lines between the practitioner and the patient is really important. It looks a little bit more even psychoanalytical, even though they were very much against Freud, but that therapeutic relationship is really important. One of the things that I think helped to move this along was an abiding interest in some of the anthropological literature and the ceremonial practices that were also part of and a recognized part of whatever psychedelic history was at that time. I'm most familiar with Humphrey Osmond, so I'm going to keep with him here for a moment. But Humphrey Osmond was very curious about what was happening in these rituals. What can we learn from rituals that will help us to design better therapeutic environments? Now, they're not using the terms set and setting that will be coined by Timothy Leary in 1962, but they have a chapter on set and they have a chapter on setting. So I'll leave you to decide whether they were thinking about it in their guidebook. So they're definitely very kind of aware of the idea that people's mindsets are very important coming into these experiences, and that the setting where you experience your psychedelic is also really important. In 1956, the team spread out in various places in Saskatchewan, but Osmond, Hoffer, Weckowitz, and Blewett were invited to sit in a ceremony invited by the Red Pheasant Cree First Nation in Saskatchewan to participate in a ceremony with the Native American Church. And it was partly because the RCMP or the police force were, harassing, really, I'll say those words. They were harassing Indigenous communities in this area, saying that they were having these, and I'm quoting from the record that went to Health Canada, they were having disgusting orgies. They were having these all-night parties and they were having disgusting orgies, and that this needed to be stopped. And there were efforts to try to change the Indian Act to make sure that these ceremonies were prohibited. And it was at that moment that Osmond was invited by the federal government to go in and give kind of like a clear direction to the government as to what's going on in these ceremonies. And perhaps you can see Osmond is one of the fellows in glasses there. There's Frank Takes Gun has got a pipe, or it's a whistle actually, in the center. And Osmond is sort of behind him or beside him taking notes. Osmond participated in that ceremony fully. He took 4 peyote buttons that night. And he then testified to the federal government and continued to write to others after this point saying, the federal government is wrong. These are sacred ceremonies. They need to be protected. And moreover, they have healing potential. We should be learning from some of these ceremonies. Now, I'm not going to pretend that it was, in 1956, he was totally woke. There's still some rough language in places. But the next iteration of their guidebook includes acknowledgement of the work done by the Native American Church in thinking about things like bringing drumming or music or acoustics into the clinical setting as a way of setting a tempo or helping to anchor some of the emotional experiences by tapping into some of the kind of natural responses to music and song. Now, they didn't ultimately necessarily bring in a whole bunch of, peyote songs, but they did begin to start playing with different ideas around music and sound, I should say, more broadly. And then, since no one's making me stop talking, I'll just keep saying one more thing here. On the right-hand side of the screen, these are photographs that, I took the top one, and the bottom one was a friend of mine who took it of me. I've been very honored that the grandchildren of some of the people seated in these pictured in these black and white photos have invited me to participate in not only ceremonies, but also to learn about these practices today that continue to this day. So that's a research project that we have ongoing to help to preserve some of that history and learn more about these ceremonies that continue. All right. So we also know that there are other non-clinical observers or enthusiasts or curious folks who are drawn to this kind of research, and not, I think, in part due to the healing outcomes, but also because there was some room, that kind of capaciousness that I mentioned before. And sort of famously, Bill W. wrote to Humphrey Osmond and asked about, what are you guys doing with alcoholics? And by this time, Osmond and others are working to treat alcoholism using initially high dose LSD. And I would say that they really had no idea what they were doing with doses. So the doses kind of range all over the place. In the patient records, you see, 100 micrograms. I've seen as high as 1,500 micrograms of LSD in one session. We see LSD with a mescaline chaser. You see mescaline with, coffee in between, and then they change, they're really figuring things out. So I wouldn't say that there's any sort of clear consensus at that time. But what they do find in the patient trials is that a lot of patients or subjects, I say subjects because some people volunteer to come in, others are in the hospital and are designated as patients, although they all have consent forms attached, I should mention. What they find is that people aren't really responding the way they necessarily hope. They don't necessarily want to talk about their alcoholism. They talk about a whole variety of things, including and often a kind of spiritual connection. And it is sometimes religious, and it is oftentimes more spiritual than sort of religious. And Bill W., that's the piece that Bill W. gets excited about and latches onto a little bit. In his correspondence with Osmond, he says, with step 2, to sort of submit yourself or accept that there is a higher order than yourself. Sorry for my paraphrasing there. He said, maybe LSD could help people get there, because that's often a step that they find people have trouble with, and it's hard to stay in the 12-step program at that stage. And Bill W. quietly, has his own LSD experience that Osmond brokers, and he agrees that this is a very powerful and useful tool, but one that he feels very nervous about. He just want to be the spokesperson or have his face attached to it as the then only remaining co-founder of an organization that prides itself on abstinence. And then we kind of know where this story goes, right? So things seem to be going well if we just look at psychedelic psychiatry in and of itself, but the larger kind of cultural and political context, it's still a very small kind of, we might think about it as there's a psychedelic bubbling effect here as well. The folks within the community are very convinced that psychedelics are on the path of justice. And outside, there's a lot of momentum behind pharmaceutical turn, changing psychiatry in a different direction. And there's also, of course, an increasing kind of countercultural appetite for taking psychedelics and attaching them to different political projects that have much less to do with, repathologizing madness or seeing people in different ways, but really have to do with often more political objectives, but also creative and, recreational objectives. And that, I think, has really animated the responses in the Prohibition era. And these are a few examples. Did you know that the first issue of High Times is this grainy image? I don't have a better one, unfortunately, of someone, I believe she's about to eat that mushroom. I can't be sure, but yeah, I was excited when I found that. And it's not just Haight-Ashbury and San Francisco that sort of grabs hold of the idea that psychedelics can, infuse or, bring about this kind of countercultural expression, or Jerry Garcia is not the only guy who figured out you could play guitar for 3 hours or whatever. This is happening in a variety of different places around the world. And we don't always, I think that myself here in Canada, and certainly the studies that I did at the beginning of the 2000s, I wasn't aware of and didn't appreciate how widespread the kind of embrace of psychedelics was around the world, some of which we see through, Allen Ginsberg goes to India, and, that's a more of an American story, I'd say, than anything. But there are also other places, Japan. We see the hippie trail forming, going through the Middle East. There's a psychedelic society in Israel in the 1960s. And again, there's a shout out to Brazil there. There are different ways that these ideas find expression in different cultural corners as well, not just within the clinical context. By the end of the 1960s, I'm sorry, I know I'm clipping out like a whole bunch of history here, but I think you all probably want to get on with your days too. By the end of the 1960s, it seems that there's a fever pitch of interest in psychedelics, and they are, going to tear the world asunder, at least if you're reading headlines or, just watching the kind of thin veneer of news media that's available at that time. This idea that, people are going to jump off of buildings, they're going to stare at the sun, kids are going to be eating sugar cubes laced with acid. These are all stories that were, came out of particular regions and then were syndicated and kind of really started circumnavigating, and certainly throughout North America. You see some of the same headlines showing up, attaching themselves to different places, despite the truth of the matter. Richard Nixon declares a war on drugs. The United Nations, places psychedelics on a Schedule 1 banned substances list. And, this seems to create a different legal context for now adjudicating psychedelics, whether in a ceremonial or in a medical or clinical context. And in many ways, if you read lots of the earlier literature on the history of psychedelics, that's kind of where the story ends. And yet, of course, we know that isn't where the story ends. We're here today still talking about psychedelics, and they didn't just like disappear off the landscape for a while and then reemerge. And when David Nutt said, "Hey, wait a second, we should think about these again," or Rick Doblin, started MAPS, or there isn't a particular catalyst or turning point, because some of these stories have continued to proliferate in different ways. One example is the kind of underground network of, I've got examples here of blotter acid or Mary Jane Superweed, probably a made-up name, homegrown highs. There's a whole variety of catalogs of mushroom cultivation and mushroom picking, foraging, the basement shaman. Some of these kinds of guides that begin to proliferate, particularly as desktop publishing becomes cheaper, more accessible, and we see a bit of history of technology fitting in here as well. And then, of course, a shout out to Alexander or Sasha Shulgin, who continued to kind of straddle these lines of legal production of materials or the production of new psychoactives faster than the FDA could figure out what to do with them. And he becomes a kind of, in my view, he's an important figure in this history because he continues to stay in a bit of a public space. So for the future of the history of psychedelics, if that is not a meta moment, I think that some of the future, we might begin to see a different history if we look beyond some of the conventional ways that we've come to study history, the way that we privilege certain kinds of evidence in history. And I'm going to suggest that, some of the artwork is where I've been focusing some of my time lately, and I find it absolutely amazing and inspiring. So Rita Hooney Queen is a 20-something. I should figure out what year it is now. I think she's 26 now. Anyway, a young artist and activist in Brazil. And she is producing artwork that not only is inspired by different ayahuasca journeys and relationships with ayahuasca, but she's part of an artist collective that uses the proceeds of their artwork to reinvest in language preservation in the Amazon region. And it's a really fascinating way of thinking about a different psychedelic justice moment, or a different kind of psychedelic justice movement, that, this is also about preservation of culture in a different way. And another example, Rene Alvarado Martinez is in Oaxaca, Mexico. He grew up very close to where Maria Sabina grew up. And he actually uses soil from around where she grew up specifically, and as the pigment in his artwork that are often also in honor of her. And you can see her sort of depicted in some of these pieces of art. There are a few more online. But this kind of rethinking the relationship of plants and ideas to their places and repositioning them back in situ is something that I think is really interesting within the context of the future of the history of psychedelics, or how will we be remembered in this time? Oh, wait, sorry. You all know the headlines. There's also other ways that this history may be remembered, or other sort of competing features, whether that's breakthrough therapies or not, in the case of the relatively recent Lykos decision. But we're starting to see these things pop up in different ways. It's exciting to me that there are new histories being written in a variety of different languages. I mentioned Alex Guerin at the beginning. His new book, Global Ayahuasca, is, a Brazilian ayahuasca tradition that moves to Asia and how that takes root. Anyway, there are a few different examples here in different languages. Hopefully, some of these are also featured in an English translation, or parts of them are featured in an English translation in our book. So I want to end just by thanking you for indulging me for how long I've been speaking. But also, I think that one of the things that's really exciting about the future of psychedelics right now is that the future is not yet set. That there are many different ways that psychedelics have inspired people in the past, and that they have real meaning and real poignancy when we put them back into those cultural settings. And when we imagine not just the experience of taking psilocybin, for example, or MDMA or whatever it might be, but thinking about what the stakes are for reinvigorating discussions about whether it's treatment or spirituality or language acquisition or language retention. When we think about public health, when we think about access to publicly funded health, for example, I'm in Canada, so we'll say that. And we think about those big questions about scale and their relationship to culture. To me, that is what is at stake in a psychedelic resurgence. And I hope that we can continue to hold that frame wide as we continue to invest in, whatever, however we're studying psychedelics. I hope we can, keep that tent large or keep the frame wide for lots of conversation. And so this is a great way to start your. I hope that leaves lots of room to invite lots of people to your series. I think that's it. Yeah, that's just my conclusion.
Thank you so much, Erika. Yeah, I think this is what I had hoped for in this first event to get the conversation started. So, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to um now that, well, we have a lot to chew on, so it might take a moment. That gave me a lot to chew on, which I'm very excited about. But I want to open up the floor for questions. Maybe after you take a breath for a moment, because I know you've been
No
just
worries.
so I mean, I think if anyone wants to, let me make sure I can see everyone. But I would say if anyone here has a question, feel free to just speak up. I have a couple things written down, but I'm gonna hold off on that for a moment. Okay.
Thank
See
you.
if you well, maybe while people are thinking, I know that someone had sent in a question. This is from Owen at the University of Waterloo via Ashley. So Owen was asking, which this is definitely related, for students interested in the history and philosophy of science, medicine, and technology, what have you found helpful in investigating psychedelics, i.e., methods, theories, frames of reference, resources, etc.? I'm sorry, I assumed it was the University of Wisconsin. Okay. Thank you, Ashley.
Okay. Uh, that's probably an essay long question or something or answer. I
Mhm.
mean, feel free to email me about that. I know the University of Wisconsin has a wonderful program right now. I think it's the transdisciplinary study of pharmaceuticals and psychedelics. Somebody will, correct me on that, or you can Google those terms, and maybe Ashley's already familiar with that. I know the director of the history of pharmacy there is a former postdoc and a friend of mine. And trying to bring together these different streams. It's really, I think Wisconsin actually has a really interesting program because they've got buy-in from the pharmacists who are often kind of on the front lines of answering a lot of questions that people have, even about substances that are not yet legal. And I think Wisconsin's also got a historical place for doing drug testing analysis. This isn't totally answering the question, but I think there are some real opportunities here for exploring those intersections. And within the history and science of philosophy and technology, or history and philosophy, science and technology, I think those big epistemic questions are often what drives that field, what drives our discipline. Thinking about how do we philosophize this historical event. And to me, psychedelics are just so rich and fertile for those kinds of questions. They're riddled with ethical questions, and even beyond the kind of ethical questions, there are big moral questions. that move outside of the frame of, again, like getting your ethics approved to do interviews. But like, is this the right thing to do? Is it the right thing to publish about these ceremonies? Today we're like, yes, we're reconciling and this is good, but there is a reason why for thousands of years, people don't talk about what is sacred. And knowing it does not mean that we should necessarily make that visible now. And so those questions, which are not part of I just did an ethics application, so I'm just down on it right now. That's not part of the conversation in the day-to-day logistics of how do we manage our ethical careers. But maybe that kind of larger question is something, and those are the kinds of things that HTSP, whatever your acronyms are, history and philosophy, science and technology programs can really grapple with. And I think it's one of the reasons why I think psychedelics are really, we need to be interdisciplinary as we think through some of these questions, that this isn't the domain of one field that can solve all the questions for us, because there's just too many implications for what will happen if, the genie's out of the bottle already in some respects. The toothpaste is out of the tube, but now what we make of that, how we move forward in a good way, is going to require a lot of different minds working through these questions. Yeah, Dan. Oh, sorry, Nathan.
Oh, was somebody else about to speak? I'm sorry.
I just had my hand up because I don't know why, but the little hand thing seems to be missing from my screen. So I just, can I ask a question now, Nathan? Is this, did you have a
Oh,
question? I can
absolutely.
defer.
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, it just was fantastic. I just want to thank you, Erika, for that. It's just really stimulating and also just visually magnificent, really beautiful. And you've just shown us all this great diversity, historically, culturally, functionally, medical use, traditional use. What we weren't seeing was maybe some of that authoritarian use. Like we did see that January 6th, right? We all saw that with that QAnon shaman. And I'm just wondering, but I don't know enough about it. I'm wondering, is there a whole place where there's that kind of far right authoritarian use of psychedelics because all this great diversity, nevertheless, we might say it could be under an umbrella of something like creativity and inclusivity. But is there another space, or is that just a couple of incidences? Or might there be another set of images there that we could be looking at?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I certainly don't want to be like, I don't want to suggest that this is just, we should romanticize this past and it's been all good. There are lots of, whether it's QAnon or, well-intentioned therapists, even there have been a whole variety of ways that psychedelics have also been part of projects that I think we would probably find consensus in this room saying like that was bad. And not like we know better today. Like it was bad at the time, and it was bad even by conventional standards at the time. And in some ways that is not unique to psychedelics. And yet psychedelics have a kind of public relations issue that I don't think we can afford to ignore that part of the past or part of the current situation as well. I don't think, despite what maybe I'm going to like trash on Netflix here, but despite what we might see in a few examples, I'm sorry, I won't put anybody under the bus here, but like, let's just say Seth Rogen, for example, if he was no, just kidding. But if you were gonna just follow certain psychonauts, everything is wonderful and great. And I think some of that media attention and high profile kind of celebrity testimonials also overwhelm some of the stories. So you get that kind of hype in combination with these really, really important, but really nasty counterexamples. And those kind of vie for our attention. And, I have a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old, and like, despite my long lectures, they mostly don't listen to me, and they just, they grab onto headlines and TikToks and things, right? Like I have really important things to say, but, it's really hard to compete with that. The way that information gets packaged and I mean, those experiences are real. And they also get a disproportionate amount of attention, I think, in this larger landscape. So I've been kind of playing with this idea. I've just put in a SSHRC grant for a project that I'm kind of affectionately in my own notes calling like Just Say No, like KNOW. Like we need to kind of turn the script on a prohibition era that caricatures our understanding of drug literacy, like this drug's good, this drug's bad, these people are good, and opens up the kind of uncomfortable nuance and complexity and messiness of the way, you know, there are risks with all sorts of substances and behaviors. But we need to kind of like roll up our sleeves and I think be aware of like, we're not going to be able to control. It's not just a matter of like, you have to do a political test before you're allowed to take psychedelics, or we suspend your driver's license when you take MDMA or something. Like, I don't think some of those regulations are going to help to mitigate the issues that they're going to happen if psychedelics continue to be greenlit in the way that they are, regardless of Health Canada's approval. I mean, you know, with the kind of cultural approval of I don't know how many people tried to watch the Mike Tyson fight, but I didn't really care. But I was curious after his, you know, after his psychedelic experiences, if that was going to make him a good fighter. But it turned out Netflix should crash. So, so my
Thank you
aforementioned
for that.
13-year-old son. But, sorry.
No, it's a great answer, and it's just that it's very complicated. I think there's just a lot of us who are in this, some way in this field now. There's this, we're excited about it, and there's kind of these assumptions that these plant medicines lead to something like universalist values, and I'm just not sure that that's true. I'd like it to be true, but yeah, it's obviously a lot more complicated than that. So, but thank you for your answer. It was, yeah, nuanced.
I'll just say one more thing on that. I think there's a real temptation, and I get it. I have this temptation too, to like, we lived in this kind of prohibition that we see the holes in that prohibition. Like it was so phony in so many ways that there's a temptation just to like flip the script, you know, like move past that and say, no, it's not that bad. But that would be, you know, not really learning from that prohibition era and recognizing that like, yeah, there's some bad stuff and there's some good stuff. And how do we manage that? How do we, you know, invest in education programs so that we have nuanced harm reduction, informed language? What are we going to put on the label? You know, kind of, you know, not recommended to drive for 8 to 12 hours, or like, don't take a philosophy class right now. You should really like stay away. You know, like what you could imagine the different ways that we might give warnings about what to do under these conditions. And I think we're so far from having any kind of consensus or comfort. We've gotten used to these kind of soundbited ways of interpreting that information that I think it's not very exciting, but like tune in, turn on, slow down, or read more. I don't know, like it's not as exciting.
Thank you.
Sorry, one more thing. Has anybody read Blitzed? You come across this book? It got a lot of attention. It's a German journalist who wrote about methamphetamines and the Nazis. And he's written a new book. It's in German. It's been translated to French. As far as I know, it's not in English yet, but it's coming. So brace yourself. He claims that the Nazis were also taking LSD. And if that book has as much attention as his previous book, Blitzed, I think this is going to hit the psychedelic community in a really hard way, but in an important way. Now, it seems that according to my colleagues who are working in the Sandoz archives and read German, there's not a lot of evidence in this book, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to get a ton of attention and is going to fit into preconceived ideas about the direction that psychedelics are going in anyway. So I don't actually know what the title is or what it will be in English, but watch for it, because I think, you know, it's stories like that, and it only takes a few that start to change and create these kind of ideological cleavage in how to manage some of these, you know, big important kind of PR structures that will have a huge impact on how we talk about these things in more nuanced ways, and the nuance will disappear. Sorry, that was a really long answer, but thank you for that. Blitzed is kind of interesting, but you know. Sorry, I see.
Olga.
I think you're muted.
Oh, here we go. Hold on. don't want you to see my dirty dishes. My question is kind of related to that last comment. How do I, as a scholar, be able to manage this tension between what is accessible for information, whether right or wrong or fake or redone, amidst also the scholarship that is redirecting and reconfiguring, rereading, going back to the past, kind of reevaluating what are the stories, what did we miss, what didn't we look at? Like, it's such a dynamic movement that, to Anne's point, doesn't necessarily guarantee that if you access the transcendental space through whatever you want to call them, entheogens or psychedelics or hallucinogenics, and let's make a list of all of the different names that they've been called, that it's going to guarantee sort of this evolution to a better place. I don't know. Like, that's, it's an interesting thing to consider, the tension of these different moving parts, and how do we affect maybe more, maybe not evolution, but maybe more of a intellectual awakening or something, or discernment, right? Because that's part of my own experience in academia, is how to acquire critical thinking and analysis, so that when I am uptaking, I have some questions to say, really, is that true? I don't know. And I can't go back and experience it. So it's just, maybe it's more of a comment than a question, but it offers these really diverse, interesting conversations.
Yeah, I think, I see this on display in different conference settings as well. And, psychedelics are wonderful because you go to a psychedelic meeting and, no, you can't even assume that everyone will be wearing shoes. Like, you get people from a whole variety of walks of life. Thank you for, that wasn't meant to be an offensive comment, so thank you for your laughs. But I mean, I can be talking to a pharmacologist and an artist, and, there are people who are new agers and old agers. Like, there's a whole variety of kind of minds who come together in that. And that's, I'm being a bit romanticizing here, it's a bit idyllic. But it's interesting because, I work on history of science, history of medicine, and that's not always the case. And so I think as a humanities trained person, I'm very used to going to places where, like, the answer, my thesis is, it's complicated, it's messy, there's no consensus, we need to think about like everything. And then you go and you talk to Health Canada and they're like, what should we do? And you're like, oh, well, you see, it's complicated. And then the Zoom call ends and you don't get invited back. So this tension between like trying to find ways of communicating in ways that are driving towards consensus, and our orientation as scholars in other ways of like avoiding consensus, like to say, oh, it's really simple. Like, I will lose my job, they'll take away my PhD. Like, that's just not how history works, right? Or how humanities works. But I think that's actually, we're in a generative moment. And, if we fast forward to whatever appropriate time in the future, hopefully they'll think back and say, no, despite all of the examples around us, and I think there was an election recently, like there may be some historians in the future who are like, these are dark days. But there also might be some positives, or this might be a generative moment where we like sat back and say, like, wait a second, like, what do we trust? How do we organize and prioritize different forms of, I'll say evidence again, but information? I mean, whether it's, we can see this on display in a variety of ways with whether it's social media, or like vaccines were a good example of, where did people find the bit that they would grab onto to trust? And I think, psychedelics are in a similar moment. We have an opportunity to think about, like, let's kind of crack this thing open and think about not, should MDMA be approved for couples therapy? Maybe. But I don't think that's the point. I think it's like, how are we going to agree that we're going to put this evidence on the table when we make decisions? And we have an opportunity to play with that a little bit more. Also, because no one's watching, like, we're getting our funds cut, so we might as well. Sorry, you're muted again. Sorry, Olga, I'm sure you had witty response,
I
but I
always
couldn't
have,
hear it.
I always have comments. I talk to
Oh,
myself a
sorry.
lot. I live alone. I talk to my animals. I'm just agreeing with you. And so I speak out loud to myself. Zoom's watching. We are recording this right now. It is now accessible in the future by all, forever memorialized. As long as the cloud exists, we exist. Here we are. We've already uploaded our consciousness.
Uh-oh. Sorry, Bridget, I think you had a question as well.
Hi, thanks so much. I was really intrigued. I'm very interested in the first person experience in psychedelic training and sort of the idea of self-experimentation and some parameters for people to take records and have it, to improve citizen scientists. So I'm intrigued for the 1952 guidebook, if that's available somewhere, and then just sort of more broadly, if you've had research on sort of this idea of what sort of parameters somebody might follow for recording their self-experimentations.
That's a great question. I recently I teamed up with Erowid and the Erowid Vaults to, well, okay, take a step back for a second. I'm kind of like intrigued by this question of like, what is psychedelic harm reduction? And those first person accounts are really rich for thinking about how have people learned to take care of themselves and others. And it's, again, it doesn't necessarily fit into that consensus model or like a pamphlet or a guide that even some of those early guides. The 1952 one is a lot of notes and a lot of accounts and then kind of interspersed. I don't think it was meant to be circulated. They weren't polishing it up. But there's another one in 59, and I'm in the process of trying to work with that one to annotate it and then publish it as a kind of, here's how they were thinking about it in the past. So I've been thinking about this a little bit. And what's interesting is they're definitely trying to take a bunch of accounts and then find some synthesis that, like people are aware of the acoustics in the room and music is really important. And, things that we might almost find laughable now, like, of course, or like make sure that, the lights aren't too bright. Make sure that, you don't have a washroom that you have to walk down a hall to get to past other people. Again, some of these are maybe just really obvious, but, these guys are voyagers in this particular moment. And it's not, I think it's in part when they go to that ceremony that they're like, oh, there's some people who've been thinking about this for a lot longer. We should just like take a beat, literally, and, listen to them. And then that correspondence begins to change and they start to engage with that. So there are all these different seams of influence that come into the picture. Arrowwood's done an incredible job of collecting those first person accounts. And what we're hoping to do in the project we've just pitched that if any of you are Shirk reviewers, watch for it. We've applied to like interview people who go to music festivals as, Zendo Project or Cosmic Minds or people who are providing care. And so far our anecdotal research, which doesn't count for much, but it's my preliminary research enough to try to write a grant, is that there are a lot of people with experience who attend music festivals. Again, hope you're sitting down for that. Some of them have taken psychedelic drugs, or all of them. And, so experience really matters also in moving that project forward. Not my project, but in moving this idea forward about like, how to learn how to care. And that in the 1950s is this real kind of division point between the introduction of randomized controlled trials, which really picks up after thalidomide in the early 1960s. You must not know, you must not have experience. We have to like sever that kind of way of knowing from how we investigate evidence to the opposite. And it may be in addition to like embracing complexity, that those experiences become part of what we have to reconnect with as like an epistemology, as we think about like, how do we evaluate evidence? Actually experience might be beneficial as opposed to something that we like only talk to each other in the hallways about because no one can admit it. You're giving your presentation, you can't admit that you've tried these substances, but in the hallways people are talking about. Anyway, that might be another piece that I suspect 50, 75, 100 years from now, they're like, experience is going to matter more as a way of anchoring evidence. And we already see it outside of the academy. Mike Tyson died when he smoked the venom of the bufo toad, and this is going to make him a better person or something. Those testimonials are really vying for our attention, and that's all about experience. And yet it really conflicts with the way that we're organizing evidence to give advice about who should take this or under what conditions. And that just seems like, why would we trust that? And I'm so pro public health, but the way that we're accumulating evidence or sifting through it seems to be at odds with how people encounter these things on their own. So yeah, my anecdotal experience is, I went to Dana Larson's shop a few weeks ago in Vancouver. He's, legally selling psychedelics in Vancouver, although his store was raided recently. And I'm like, so what do you think of the clinical trials? What is Health Canada saying? He's like, what? I don't know. People take these things, and I tell them about my experiences. He collects people's experiences. He has pamphlets where people can write in and add stuff. He's like, no. People are taking these things anyway. I can't wait for Health Canada. So things are going to move whether or not the regulations, and often I think our academic orientation or the way that we're supposed to function as academics ties us to something that removes experience.
Yeah.
Although in
And
our conversation,
I think about my medical training, like the idea that I would be taking a substance, like absolutely not, right? So it's
and
it's a
you've worked
change for sure.
If I'm remembering correctly, I mean, you have experience with palliative care work, and this is another area that, those questions, those kind of moral and ethical questions come up in really sharp relief with, is it okay in these circumstances to start thinking about applications in different ways? And yeah.
Thank you so much.
Or Nathan.
Oh, I just saw Arsha's hand earlier, so I just wanted to make sure that Arsha got a chance. But if your question passed Arsha, then Olga, then
I was keeping an eye out on the stream, and there were some questions, but you touched on some of them, so they took the question back. But I'm keeping an eye out on the stream, so if anything comes, I'll pitch in.
Thank you, Arsha.
No problem.
Olga?
I didn't have a question per se, but just to say, I'm throughout my 30 years of being in both spaces, really, through sort of altered states consciousness, learning about Stan Grof's work, and then really diving deep into the Brat Pack that I call. There's this really interesting relationship between palliative care and psychedelics, especially in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And so there's always been, those who are kind of seen as the grandmother and grandfather of, community-led end-of-life care, not only Dame Cecile Saunders and Belford Mont within the clinical, but also, Ram Dass and Joan Halifax. But they were in the other world too. And so I love this relationship. That's the one that I'm really interested in, and part of, again, bridging that true interdisciplinary lens, looking through the clinical, looking through the history, looking through the psychology, and bridging that is just fascinating. That's where my brain just starts to fire and get really excited about this work into the future. So not just a question, but thank you for the affirmation of where things might be leading, because I worry, why am I doing this? Like dedicating my life force energy. And I'm one of those folks who is a trained psychedelic sitter, therapist, nurse, and background in end of life care and those kinds of things. And so it's just, I appreciate the affirmation to keep going and not to wait, maybe. I know that's not really what you're intending to say, but, also the space of maybe utilizing cannabis. And I know that I've had this conversation, I think you as part of education, and the amount of folks that are actually using like FICO and high doses of cannabis oil to save their life, who have gone through remission, right? And the same kind of conversation. This is not a panacea. It really depends on the client and all of those different dynamics in relationship to what constitutes health and well-being for them. But there's these similar stories between those two areas. It's just really interesting how it blends together. But I would love to I can't, it's sad that I can't read Czech because I would love to go into the old archives of Stan's and be able to read, these nuanced letters of, hey, take a little rye bread before you go, kind of a thing. That would be really interesting.
There's a journalist based in Victoria, Ross Crockford. His name is not Czech, but he's fluent in Czech, and he was a journalist in Prague for 10 or 12 years. And he spent quite a bit of time going through now Prague archives. There was this Cold War thing, and there's some concerns about what was kept and what wasn't. So not to say that therefore he has all the answers, but he's done quite a bit of work on that, on the Czech story. And one of those articles is published in our book, Expanding Mindscapes. And it's just one element. He's looking at Sadska Clinic in that particular one, where Groff did work, although the particular article is not about Groff per se. But he's somebody to keep on your radar if you're interested.
What's his name, Erika? Can somebody
Oh,
put it in the chat for me? Or because I
Yeah.
do speak Czech, I just can't read it very well. I am fluent in Czech. I was born there. This is what
wow.
I am a dual citizen. So my international scholarship could bring me back home to take care of my parents while they're dying and slip them a little something. Thanks. This is very exciting for me in this way. And seeing the weaving, right? Seeing the weaving and saying, is this really important? Like, should we be looking at this? But could make good story.
It's interesting, I think, like the Czech story, which I only know from the work of people like Ross Crockford, is fascinating because they also go through like a pretty pivotal political change. And even, how you talk about that political change depended on who you were, and doctors were somewhat kept out of, Prague Spring and stuff to some extent. But even, things like Alcoholics Anonymous was banned there because you couldn't have anonymity. There couldn't be these kind of brotherhood societies or fraternal societies. So there's some really interesting parallels in terms of the time frame, but also really big differences in the Czech story, that they start producing their own LSD because Sandoz was no longer, sending it across the Iron Curtain. And the Czech physicians, as I understand it, and psychiatrists, and even some of the sexologists who got involved from the clinic there, were really fascinated by this, but severed from that. So they start creating their own ways of doing things. And I have letters from, I've seen in the archives letters from Stan Groff writing to the folks in Saskatchewan to try to get articles sent to him prior to when he then moved to Baltimore. So there's a fascinating additional
my thesis will now be Cooking in Prague, the history of making of LSD.
There you go. I love it.
I have to do it after my parents die, or otherwise they will die.
Don't let them read Blitzed. Sorry, Asha.
Yeah, so I just want to say great talk. I really enjoyed it. And we have a question in from Sheldamar, who also said excellent presentation and he enjoyed it. And he's asking if you can share any names of organizations, initiatives, or communities that are doing work that needs to be amplified.
That could be a long list. I mean, probably. I guess I would wonder what the amplification is. Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question, to be honest, because I think there's a lot of really good work going on, but yeah, it's interesting to try to imagine, where does that go to, or like how I'm interested in making connections, maybe more than amplifications, and maybe I'm misinterpreting the question there, but yeah. The relationship that I've been developing with some of the folks from the Native American church community have been so precious to me. And I feel like I'm starting all over again in learning a different way of organizing my thoughts and thinking through some of these questions that that's an example of a situation where I'm like, I don't think it needs to be amplified yet, but I'm really curious to continue, exploring some of these connections to see when to amplify, or when it should be on, I don't know, YouTube, or again, I'll pick Netflix, for example. But and not to denigrate the question, I just maybe don't understand it exactly.
Well, I guess a good extension to that would be, who do you think is doing the work that most aligns with your opinion of how we should be moving forward? It's, I mean, for me, I can think of maps that I don't necessarily think that they're doing the work that they should be doing. Not in the sense that we don't have to be pushing for MDMA to get, legalized, but in the sense that they're not doing it in the most optimized way, in my opinion. That whole rejection of the MDMA and how they designed their experimental, design wasn't the best, and it felt very rushed. It sort of just it seems to me that they weren't thinking about
Yeah.
the best way to do the research, but rather they just wanted to listen to FDA and just check their marks to push it. And my personal opinion is that we might not be ready if this is how we're
Yeah.
in it.
That's a much more specific angle on this. I'm really curious about and forgive me for like being a historian, but it is what I was trained to do. So I'm gonna just cling to it for a moment. But I'm really curious, and I do find myself musing about this as I drive to hockey games for my son or something, in really important, productive moments, like 3 o'clock in the morning when I wake up and I can't sleep. Let's do my best thinking then. Is how will this time be remembered? And like, will MAPS be the organization that is remembered, or maybe it's Symposia, or it's Chacruna, or it's, the Ottawa Psychedelically Speaking group. I mean, there are a bunch of different players in this space, and some of them are moving through rather rapidly, and some of them have more staying power. Some of them have more resources. And it's going to be interesting to see kind of where things shake down, because in some respects, it seems that there is an uncomfortable and perhaps necessary relationship between having like an agenda, like getting MDMA across the FDA finish line, for example, and funding and philanthropy. And it's an uncomfortable, and again, like maybe a required relationship. Maybe it's hard for philanthropists to say, you know what, we think you have good ideas. Just take the time you need, think about it. It's complex. You'll need that. That's hard to get people to invest in. But if you have a targeted goal, it's easier to get that funding. And in order to maintain that funding, you have to stay in the spotlight. So I tend to agree with you. I think, I kind of had this like strange moment watching those FDA decision hearings. And I'm like, I'm kind of not totally upset, or I'm not, I think it's okay. It felt a bit rushed. I was like, this isn't the end. This should be the beginning. This should be kind of like a cautionary moment where we're like, okay, we're not ready. What do we need to do to get ready? Or whatever that might mean. But I guess sort of like examining some of these relationships, those fraught relationships, the way that, the only way to get money to keep Rick Doblin flying around the world, I guess, is one thing. And then there's another answer to this that is sort of circling around in my head. And forgive me, I played soccer most of my life until I ruptured my Achilles. I played soccer and I coached soccer. And I think, if I want my soccer team to be successful, if I want to be Man City, like I don't want a whole team of Rick Doblins, but I definitely want one. Like I need someone who can hit the back of the net, but I also need people who can like run lines and keep the ball out of the net. And I need to have I need to have depth and diversity on my team in order to be successful. And if I imagine that as a way of orienting a psychedelic movement, so to speak, you probably need a few of those narcissists at the front who are going to take risks and shots when I think that's risky. I've always been a defender myself, but we need and this is where I think we continue to sort of lean into the need for diversity, that without a Rick Doblin figure, maybe the conversation wouldn't be quite where it is. So there's some, important there. There's some that's important. But it can't just be concentrated into single individuals or characters or organizations. And again, there's a lesson here from the past I don't totally agree with this interpretation of the past, but I mean, there is a sense that like everything was going fine, and then Timothy Leary came along and he like peed in the soup, and he ruined it for everybody. And like, if only that guy hadn't have been so reckless, like it would have been fine. Now, I think that's a gross oversimplification. He is not to blame, and he actually was like, Humphrey Osmond thought he was really square when they first met. Like he was very bookish and like buttoned down. He had his shoes on, that kind of thing. So I think there's a risk in sort of collapsing this history, but also the future in the faith that we might have, or the, revulsion we might feel towards a particular individual or particular idea. Because I think it really runs the risk of oversimplifying again. And then, that has all sorts of different domino effects. Does that even come close to answering your question?
100%. That was very insightful.
Okay. I don't know if Man City's winning these days, but they won a lot of games. So,
Well, I want to be mindful of time because this has been great. I'm glad we, are doing what we aim to do and generating conversation. I mean, I will see, does anybody else have any other? Okay. Yeah. Heather?
Yeah, totally. So thank you so much for this, Erika. So you've mentioned actually public health a couple of times in this chat, and in terms of like, how can public health sort of step into this space? And apart from adopting your say no to psychedelics campaign and promoting that, like how can sort of public health step into the space in order for, and especially at this pivotal moment, I think like post-pandemic where, trust in public institutions is at an all-time low, God forbid, should we continue getting lower down, like where is, I guess, how, if you could click your heels and be like, hey, this is what I'd like to see from a leadership perspective in public health, what would it look like?
Oh, awesome question. During the pandemic, I don't know if he's my friend anymore, it'll become apparent why. My friend, colleague said, this is going to be a big deal. We should probably be like historians of the present and go out and like measure things and capture experiences and stuff. And that's why we shouldn't be friends anymore. Because I was like, that's a bad person to have around when you have children you're homeschooling. He was too, though. And one of the organizations we partnered with, we had, I think, 63 organizations who identified as kind of on the front lines of some element of public health. Now that includes, Saskatoon Fire Agency, as well as the Food Bank and Prairie Harm Reduction, or our Only Needle Exchange. So this kind of like big tent again picture of like, how are you actually managing the health needs and health crisis? And that was like, well, there's a housing crisis and there's a food crisis and all of that. And it became really clear in those many, many, many hours of interviews and things that things are stretched, and there's also a really competitive model with a lot of agencies within public health that are, trying to find breadcrumbs, except during the pandemic for a few moments when they had core funding and they worked together. And it was actually kind of like, they're like, don't tell anybody, but like there were some real positives, not positive like COVID and, meth overdoses, but positives like they weren't competing with each other for breadcrumbs of funding, and they were able to make some planning, even though it was not long-term, it was still in a crisis situation. But the way they talked about their capacity to change their decision-making structure was really important. So it strikes me that, we could take some lessons from that. And where psychedelics fit into this is we could not, despite my many efforts, talk about psychedelics. It was like, sorry, we are like trying to keep, sorry, my kids just got home. We are trying to keep so many balls in the fire that our Prairie Harm Reduction just said, like, there's no psychedelic harm reduction. We don't deal with that. We're only dealing with, this is what harm reduction looks like. And this is, all hands on deck and people burning out, trying to meet the absolutely desperate needs at the time. So they're just, it's been interesting though. Okay. So paragraph break. Last Friday, I was in a federal jail. I was asked to give a talk to parole officers about psychedelics. And I was like, oh joy, what's this going to be? But it was around Indigenous healing. And I was there with members of the Native American Church as well. And part of what they were saying is that like, we are out of ideas. And this sounded much more like my COVID project. We are out of ideas we need to work across lines. We need to think differently. We have people who are just cycling through. They're not even bad people. These are parole officers telling us this. This is not sustainable, what we're dealing with here in terms of, again, their words, addicts, and like the gaps, the gulfs in the public health system in terms of like finding the kind of support and, in this case, healing ceremonies. I know this will sound ridiculous, but like, I think some core funding would be really helpful if I was queen of the world or, guru of the planet. Like some core funding so that, people are able to do their jobs instead of have to fight for a way to be off the side of their desks while managing frontline services in other ways. And to be able, I'm from Saskatchewan. That doesn't mean I like ventriloquize Tommy Douglas all the time, but like sometimes. But preventative care is like ultimately cheaper than emergency care. And somehow we've really gotten away from that with this idea that, everything can just be pushed through the emergency room doors. And it again just kind of pushes people through one portal that doesn't actually manage the needs. And I think this is probably true wherever you all are, but food prices and inflation have created problems that are so deeply public health related, and yet we seem just unable to meet those needs. And we keep finding, like, again, we go back to those same agencies and they're like, well, there's a budget over here and we're on this budget line and we can't talk to each other and we got to do this. And you guys apply for the fund this time and next time we'll go for food. Like, that's ridiculous. Sorry if that is not much of an answer.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Heather. Well, yeah, I think we're nearing. I also know your kids just got home, so I want to respect that. I do have a quick, more trivial, like a come down question, if you will, since we've gotten pretty deep here. But I don't want to take the last question if anybody has anything else. So I'll open the floor for a second. Okay. I was just wondering, kind of nerding out about this. My research is on trip reports, so I got very excited about the Arrowwood thing. I'm going to basically be climbing down into the vaults and throwing away the key, I think. But I was just wondering, you mentioned meeting Anne Shulgin, and obviously Sasha and Anne Shulgin are a big kind of like influence on the experience report genre, I would say. But anyways, that's irrelevant. The question was just if there was anything cool about meeting her, if there was anything notable, or if it was just.
It was so cool to meet her. Well, so many things are cool, but I will pick one for now. And then next time we'll talk about other ones. She gifted me a piece, a San Pedro cutting from her garden, and then like expertly wrapped it up and explained. And I was like, but I have to cross a border and it's COVID and they're going to check my luggage. And she's like, oh dear, here's what you're going to say. And it was just the sweetest, like, you don't say no to Anne Shulgin. and it's San Pedro and it's still alive. I managed to keep it alive in the Saskatchewan climate, obviously indoors. But that was just a cherished moment. And it was absolutely sweet how she just, she's like, and this is how you're going to care for it. And this is, we need to keep the plants alive. And so that was just such a sweet gesture. And then I've tried to take a page from her gesture forward and have either a piece of plant or something that I can bring to people, even if it's not a San Pedro plant or one with psychoactive properties. But it served me well. So I take that lesson from her and I pass it on to you as something that is really kind of sweat. She was 91 first time I met her. So just to place that in context.
No, that's awesome though. That's a very cool tidbit. So thank you so much. This was an amazing first event. Thank you to all of you for asking such great questions and for being involved, and stay tuned. We'll be sending out more updates soon. If you're interested in submitting anything for the graduate student conference, the call will be out within the week. So thank you all again. We will call it here, and I'm sure I'll see most of you soon. Thank you again, Erika.